and saying that therapeutic efficacy is not the only thing Arnold and Emerson have going for them. This latter tension is between pragmatism and empiricism. Not empiricism in the sense of Bacon's claim that one should base scientific conclusions on observational results, rather than on, say, the texts of Aristotle, but in the sense that an experience might, all by itself, give one good reason to change one's outlook on the world, to shift, for example, from naturalism to some form of supernaturalism or the reverse. The tension I've been describing can be exhibited in more detail by turning to the second set of ambiguities I distinguished earlier, ambiguities in the meaning of the term experience. These ambiguities appear as soon as one asks whether James subscribes to what Wilfrid Sellars called the myth of the given, the myth that Wittgenstein helped us dissolve in his discussion of private beetles in the Philosophical Investigations. On Sellars and Wittgenstein's view, there is no such thing as the intrinsic content of an experience. To report an experience is simply to respond to being in a certain brain state with whatever sentences one's linguistic community has programmed one to use in that situation. If this view is right, then a change from a religious to a non-religious outlook, or the converse, can never be a matter of drawing information from the content of a new experience. The desirability of such a change can be evaluated only by reference to the practical advantages of switching from one linguistic community to another. For example, from responding to certain brain states with Wesleyan rather than Catholic sentences, or with Freudian sentences rather than Christian sentences. Only if Wittgenstein and Sellars are wrong can the sentence, "I switched from naturalism because of an experience of God that I once had," count as an acceptable explanation of one's religious conversion. On Sellars' view, there is no tertium quid called experiential content that intervenes between the altered state of the nervous system and the verbal behavior that ensues upon that alteration, verbal and other behavior that ensues upon that alteration. As we Sellarsians put it, we cut out the middleman. The existence of such an intermediary is the issue that in contemporary philosophical debates sets Brandom against McDowell and Dennett against Chalmers. Sometimes, especially in Chapter 1, James uses experience in the merely Sellarsian sense of introspectively reportable change in the nervous system, whether externally or internally caused, that produces changes in belief or desire. But most of the time he uses it in the bad old Lockean way, as a name for an entity taking its place on the stage of the Cartesian inner theater, an entity that can be studied in order to decide what description fits it best. This is the view that Sellars famously satirized by the tale of an infant mind confronting the manifold of sense and saying to itself, "There's another one, and another, a splendid specimen. By the methods of Mill, this must be what Mother calls a red." The Sellars-Wittgenstein-Brandom-Dennett view is obviously congenial to pragmatism, for it reduces the experience of seeing something red or experiencing the presence of God to the behavior that is induced by that experience. It asks after the effect on conduct of such experiences rather than for the intrinsic phenomenological character of the experiences themselves. It thinks of the experiential content of a belief as something that may or may not correspond, It thinks of the experiential content of a belief not as something that may or may not correspond to something real, but rather as consisting entirely in the inferences that a certain linguistic community permits to be drawn from and to that belief. A Sellarsian would never say, for example, what James says in order to fend off Freud, namely that if one, I quote James, looks at the immediate content of the religious experience, one will see how wholly disconnected it is from the content of the sexual consciousness. That strikes Salesians as bad as saying that pain certainly don't feel like brain processes, or that introspection will reveal whether one is in love or merely inflamed by passion. Sellers can see many reasons to agree and many to disagree with Freud's account of religious beliefs, but none of these reasons are the results of phenomenological inquiry, because there is no such thing as phenomenological inquiry. Another way to put the contrast between the Salersian and the traditional empiricist view is to say that for a pragmatist like Dewey, whose views, unlike James and Varieties, are untrammeled by any form of empiricist foundationalism, it's misleading to say, as James does, that, quote, religious experience spontaneously and inevitably engenders myths, superstitions, dogmas, creeds, and metaphysical theologies, close quote. That's no more accurate than it would be to say that sensory experience spontaneously and inevitably generates cosmological hypotheses, or that moral experience spontaneously and inevitably generate moral experiences spontaneously and inevitably generate legal codes. The creeds, the hypotheses, and the codes are all generated by the attempts of individuals and communities to solve their problems, to lead happier lives. The immediate content of experience is a wheel that plays no part in the mechanisms that produce solutions to those problems. Appeal to such content will always be an empty, dormitive power sort of appeal, sort of explanation. James was, unfortunately, in my view, a radical empiricist as well as a pragmatist. His version of empiricism is nicely summed up in the reason he gives for thinking it false, that reason is an outdated survival mechanism, an obsolete way of solving problems that can now be solved without it. He thinks that view shallow, he says, because, quote, as soon as we deal with private and personal phenomena as such, we deal with realities in the completest sense of the term. This is the view that he shared with Bergson, that it's real if it's the product of immediate, unconceptualized experience, or it's given in immediate, unconceptualized experience. And this Bergsonian view led him to adumbrate such notions as that of a world of pure experience in his last books. But if one is a Salersian, the idea of such a world is a chimera, just as are the phenomenological attitude and the first-person point of view. It's one thing to say that one's private hopes, fears, and fantasies have rights that trump Clifford's claim that nobody has a right to believe anything unsupported by evidence. Granting such rights is the point of both the Will to Believe essay and of the passage I quoted earlier about the need for human diversity, the passage that urges that different men may all find worthy missions. It's also the point of a passage that James quotes from Leuba, how do you pronounce L-E-U-B-A? That he quotes from Leuba in his conclusions chapter, one in which Leuba says that the question of whether God exists is irrelevant to the religious life, as long as belief in him is useful to the believer. It's quite another thing, however, to set up a Bergsonian metaphysics of feeling in opposition to the metaphysics of cognition common to Hegel, Green, and Royce. Pragmatism, when disconnected